Back in episode 11, I talked about the Lake Buena Airfield, and I talked about something called the Airlando Park that the Bronson family had built. And I had figured out that it was on the southern edge of their property, and that's not actually true. It was on the northern edge of their property, which would be right about here. This spot that I'm standing on is actually where the Airlando Park once stood. This is where the air park was, and this is where the Bronsons landed their aircraft. Let's go into a little more detail about it and think about what it meant.
So yeah, I did get a little confused about which was which because there were actually three airports in play. You had the Airlando Air Park that already existed on the property. You had the Airport of the Future that Walt Disney had envisioned for his property. And you had the Lake Buena Airfield that was actually constructed and in use for some period of time and to some degree still exists in the Walt Disney World Resort. As I pointed out in a previous video, Walt Disney talked about an airport of the future at the southern edge of his property. That would be the area over his left shoulder. But the interesting thing is, when Walt Disney created his blueprint for the overall Epcot, the Florida project, the Walt Disney World project, whatever you want to call it, he actually had a slightly different airport in mind. If we look at this more detailed diagram that was done, and not the one that was presented in his video, we see that the airport is more like a national airport at the time in the 1970s. It's a more sophisticated airport with multiple runways and a central hub that would maintain the guests coming to and from the airport. If we look at a satellite view of the Walt Disney World property, we can see that this airport would have been located in I-4 near where Celebration is today. If we zoom in a little bit, we can see the detail, and the airport would have actually existed in the top left corner where the scrub brush is. That would have been the location of Epcot's Airport of the Future. Of course, we know this is not where they actually built the airport. It's still undeveloped land. But they did build a small airport up near the entrance to the Magic Kingdom, the Lake Buena Airfield, that was in use for several years. But there was another airport that was the Airlando Air Park that existed on Walt Disney's property, all of the land that he bought. And where was this particular airport? Why, it was up in the top right-hand corner, near where Epcot is today. I've circled the area on his map so you can kind of get a sense of it. Now, relative to the property he bought, the airport that existed, the Airlando Air Park, was up in the top right-hand corner that I've circled here. The airport of the future that he had in mind is actually in this area that I'm pointing to with the arrow. So that's where the confusion came in. There were actually two different pieces of property that he was talking about. One where he was going to build his air park, and one where there actually existed an air park. So if we go up and we look at the Airlando Air Park, we can actually see that it existed something like this. Through one of the early flyovers that they had, this is what the air park looked like in that area that I circled. Later on, it actually looked a little bit more like this. It was a little more developed in the 1960s, or around the time that Walt Disney actually purchased the property. So looking at the overall property again through a satellite view, we can see basically where this would have been. Now, just for context, that's Epcot I'm pointing to right there. Then we can overlay the air park into the satellite view, so we can see exactly where it would have been. And that area is right there, right over by Disney Springs. So there is a little tract of land that still exists, and that's the area that I was standing on in the early part of the video. This was the Airlando Air Park that the Bronson family built in the 1950s, where they landed planes and brought them in and out of the Central Florida area. As I said, there weren't many opportunities to get planes in and out of the area, so having an airstrip in a remote area like this that was on their property would have been extremely helpful. For reference, until very recently, there were some independently owned, not owned by Disney, the Disney company that is, properties in the back behind that area that actually still house some original hangars and some of the original buildings that were there in the 1960s. On the official charts that the FAA produced, you can see the Airlando Air Park listed here in the early 1960s.
Now, the interesting Disney connection here is that Walt Disney at least twice landed his aircraft on this airfield and went over to visit his new property. So he was here on this property. You could see his airplane right here on this field, and he would have gone over to his property to visit it. So the story is that he had visited Jock's Happy Corner at some point, and that would make sense because that's only about a mile from here. So it's actually pretty close, and that would make a lot of sense if he had visited that property at some point.
And to follow up on the point I just made, if we look at where the Airlando Air Park is, relative to where Jock's Happy Corner is, we can see that it would have been an easy thing for Walt Disney to do, and conceivably he could have visited Jock's Happy Corner at some point.